if you're an investor who engages on ESG issues, you get more brownie points than if you engaged on the more traditional issues. And what I'm trying to highlight is, I think, similar to the first question when you asked me, when did I become interested in sustainability? These are just business issues, right? They're not necessarily better or worse than other business issues. So let's just start thinking about them as a long-term intangible asset rather than, as some ESG skeptics do, just thinking it's irrelevant, or as some ESG advocates do, thinking that it's the most important thing about a company.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julian Köbel. Hello and welcome to Innovations in Sustainable Finance. This is season 3 of the podcast. I'm very excited about that. I would like to thank all of you for being here and listening. I hope you enjoy it. And welcome to episode 1 of season 3. Today is a big day for me. I'm having in the podcast Alex Edmans. He's a professor of finance at London Business School. Many of you in the audience will have heard of Alex before. He's been thinking and writing prominently about sustainable finance for a long time. I'd like to emphasize that Alex has many more interesting things to say than sustainable finance. He's worked on corporate governance and behavioral finance. He has co-authored a corporate finance textbook. He has a paper about football and the stock market, and recently he published a book about critical thinking, which is called May Contain Lies. Yet he has written a lot on sustainable finance, and you might say Alex is perhaps writing faster than most of us read. So he has been an influential and a really nuanced voice in this field, and therefore I'm really excited to have you here, Alex, on the podcast.
I'm really excited to be here, Julian. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So what I would like to do in this conversation is to trace your evolution of thought regarding sustainable finance. As far as I can see, your body of work in this area spans one book titled Grow the Pie, published in 2020. Then there are at least 8 academic papers that are directly relevant to the topic, more than 13 op-eds I've counted, and 2 TED Talks. Really quite a bit of material stretched out over about a decade. What I find remarkable is that throughout you ground your arguments in academic research, not just your own, but also that of others. So with that in mind, I'd like to start at the beginning and ask you, how did you become interested in sustainability? And when did you touch upon this topic for the first time in your work?
Well, I think I've actually never been interested in sustainability, but on the same level, I've always been interested in sustainability. So how can I give 2 contradictory answers to your very first question? Is I never set out to be a sustainability person. When I was doing my PhD in finance, I thought about what drives long-term value within companies. And the first paper that I wrote, which is now identified as being a sustainability paper, looked at the effect of employee satisfaction on a company's long-term stock returns. But I never viewed this as a sustainability issue. I just viewed this as a corporate finance issue. My first job was at Morgan Stanley, where the most important assets were human capital. And so I thought it was natural to look at the link between a human capital measure and long-term stock returns. And actually, even before then, and I don't know whether this counts as one of the 8 sustainability papers you refer to, I wrote a paper on the role of large shareholders, how they can then encourage a company to invest for the long term. Now, the investment I considered was any type of investment. Yes, it could include sustainability investments, but it could include normal capital expenditure. But again, this was something where I was focused on driving long-term value creation. So I'd see myself as a general corporate finance researcher, but I think because sustainability and corporate finance are so intertwined, right now today, you cannot be a successful company without thinking very seriously about what is commonly known as sustainability issues. So that's why I'm saying I was never a sustainability person, but on the same token, I've always been a sustainability person, because you cannot think about what creates long-term value without paying attention to these sustainability factors.
Thank you. Maybe on this first paper, which is a strong result that also I see you keep referring back to, essentially it says, and correct me if I'm not summarizing it correctly, but it says that the best companies to work for, there's a list of the best companies to work for in the US, investing in those companies would have, if you had at the time, I don't know when the sample started, yielded an extra return over and beyond what the rest of the market would have given you. So in some sense, these companies performed better than expected. And that is a curious thing, right? So why does that happen? As you say, at Morgan Stanley, the most important resource is human resources. That's not a secret. And also the hypothesis that companies that have motivated employees perform well, that sounds rather common sense. So how can it be that the market undervalues this feature of companies? And does that persist over time, or is it then, once you've published your paper, being included in the approaches of investors so that it isn't the case afterwards?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a really important question, because for me to document long-term stock returns, it must be not only that employee satisfaction is important, but also the market does not think it's important. And how can the market not realize its importance? I think there's three reasons. Firstly, is I do think investors don't think it's important. You might think, well, this is bizarre. Isn't it natural to think that motivation really affects employee performance? But it's that they think motivation is easy, or there's little cross-sectional variation between firms. So how is it easy? At Morgan Stanley, you thought, well, there's no need to motivate somebody because the financial rewards and the prospect of promotion and the risk of firing, those are all sufficient. So as a boss, you don't really need to go above and beyond to make an employee feel valued. And also, as an investor, you might think, well, there's not really cross-sectional variation between the motivation in different investment banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and at the time, Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank. They all have pretty similar things. So I'm not going to be bothering trying to analyze cross-sectional differences in motivation. I'm going to instead look at their positioning in wealth management versus investment banking versus sales and trading. So then that's the first reason. They don't think it's important in that it could be important, but if it's not varying between firms, then it's not going to be a good investment criteria. The second reason is they might think it is important, but it might not manifest within their investment horizon. So if they think it's important, but they think, well, other investors don't think it's important, and also they think the market is slow to react. So in my paper, I find it takes 5 years before the market fully incorporates employee satisfaction into the price. And they may think, well, I've only got a 2-year investment horizon. Maybe I'm going to look at other things which are going to manifest faster within my horizon. And the third reason is you think it's important and you think it will manifest in your horizon, but either you don't know how to assess it because you think it's really difficult, or you think you know how to assess it, but use really simple measures. So you might think, okay, I care about corporate culture. Let me look at the CEO to worker pay ratio, or let me look at demographic diversity statistics, which are really rough proxies. And so if you're not looking at the right things, which are more fundamental measures of how employees are being treated, it can still be underpriced. And so this is why, to your final question, Julian, has this still persisted even after my paper's published? You would think it'd be crazy for it to persist, because the paper was published in 2011 showing there's an alpha to employee satisfaction. Right now, aren't investors paying more attention to these issues than they were in the past? But it was independently replicated by 2 other researchers, Hamid Bustanifer and Youngdae Kang, and they found that in the decade since my paper was published, there is still an alpha. And I think this is because even though there is supposed attention to these employee satisfaction issues, people might be using the wrong measures, the more superficial measures that I just referred to.
Fascinating. So it seems that there is still an opportunity out there. If you know how to measure it, of course, that's an essential precondition.
Yeah.
Let me move on. In your book, Grow the Pie, you make the case there are essentially 2 ways to benefit more from a pie that's in front of you. Either you take a larger piece for yourself and downsize someone else's piece, or you grow the pie so that everyone has a larger piece, including yourself. And this is expanded as pie economics over a really rewarding 400 pages, and I think it's a great analogy. Can you give us 2 examples of a company or for a business that makes profits by splitting the pie and business that made profits by growing the pie, just to illustrate the point in the context of business?
Certainly. So for a pie splitting company, I would say any tobacco company. So since 1950, we've had evidence that smoking leads to cancer. And so, well, how is it the tobacco companies are making money? It's not through creating customer welfare, I would argue it's through taking from customers, because you're able to take large amounts of money from them because it's so addictive, you're able to charge high prices, and this is not improving customer welfare, this is at the detriment to customer welfare. And on the flip side, for a pie-growing company is Novo Nordisk. So that's a large European pharmaceuticals firm. I've been really fortunate to join their Sustainability Advisory Council earlier this year. Now, Novo Nordisk is now very famous for its weight loss drugs, but let me actually shift to its core product of insulin. So insulin is something which keeps people alive, people who are suffering from diabetes. Now, that clearly creates social welfare, it leads to human flourishing, but unexpectedly, or as a byproduct, there is a benefit, because if people with diabetes are able to live longer, they will buy more insulin, and that will help Novo Nordisk down the line. Now, I'm sure when Novo Nordisk was thinking about making insulin, they didn't think instrumentally, okay, if we make more insulin, then people will live longer and buy more from us later. They just care about lengthening life because that is part of their mission. It's in their charter. It's part of what their reason for being is. But the general idea is that many ways in which you contribute to human flourishing, you might also benefit in the long term.
Thank you. Now, having reread the book, it really was rewarding. I've come away with the impression that the book is optimistic. In a good way. It's not blindly optimistic. It's carefully argued and based on thorough research. But I think it is optimistic in the sense that some of the big old problems, such as the struggle between capital and labor, climate change, health crises, and so forth, could be at least alleviated by doing business in a better way. But that's my understanding. You wrote the book to inspire people to do business in a better way. Now, looking back on it, or would you agree, first of all, that the book has a bit of optimism in it? And are you more or less optimistic today about this potential better business to solve some of these problems?
Yes, I would agree that the book is an optimistic book because the whole idea of the pie being grown suggests that it is possible, properly implemented, for business and society to both gain, rather than business having to exploit society, or the only way to protect society is to shackle and overly regulate business. So am I more or less optimistic then about the potential today? Now, most questions, I will say a bit of both, just like academics like to fence it and say it depends. But here I'm actually going to go out on a limb and say I am more optimistic. And you might think, well, that's a surprising answer. How can I be more optimistic when there are quite a lot of people with the pie-splitting mindset? So there are many people who are really anti-ESG. So let's take, with big generality, say some Republicans in the US are saying, okay, in order to protect business, we need to stop ESG being done. That is crazy to me, because ESG is a way to improve business. And on the flip side, there are people who always view business as evil, and the only way to protect society is to shackle business. So there are some pie-splitting people, but I would say that they're the vocal minority. So they make a lot of noise, but do they actually have much of an influence? I think the silent majority genuinely tries to create value and is taking responsibility seriously. So I have the fortune of interacting with a lot of businesses, companies, directors, investors, and clearly there will be a sample issue, and that maybe the ones who I interact with more are more likely to take purpose seriously, hence they want to speak to me. But I genuinely believe that many people who make important decisions will recognise that business and society are intertwined. The only way to make a business successful is to take social issues seriously, and any policymaker who wants to contribute towards social flourishing needs to make sure there is a positive role for business. There's a new Labour government being elected in the UK recently. Historically, one might argue the Labour government, the Labour Party, was sceptical about business, but this government, at least it states, at least openly, claims that a successful business sector will be key to a successful society.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. That's indeed a rare answer from an academic, and I like it a lot, because I think optimism is in short supply, at least in sort of the bubble I oversee. I think many people are skeptical, with climate change, with wars these days. The pandemic didn't help, so that's great to hear. And I agree that there is the potential of business is just never ending, but it's about bringing it out. And I feel so something, and we'll come back to that at the individual level. Much comes down to attitude, I think. So I really appreciate your attitude here. Now, moving on, you recently, last year, you published then a paper called The End of ESG. And just from reading the title, people might be surprised that you want to end what you started only a few years ago. What has driven you to write this?
I think this is an interesting question on two levels. So first I'll answer, what has driven me to write a paper called The End of ESG? So you might think, well, that's an anti-ESG paper, and given I'm a proponent of ESG, an optimistic proponent, why do I want to stop it? But I'm talking about the end of ESG as a niche field. So rightly or wrongly, the ESG term gives the impression that it should only be something of interest to people with ESG in their title. So maybe you're a sustainable fund manager, you take ESG factors into account. If you're the head of purpose or the head of sustainability within the company, you take into account. But maybe a traditional fund manager or a chief financial officer, you don't think these things are important. But what I'm highlighting is that if ESG can indeed create long-term value within a company, this should be of interest to any investor and any executive. But on the flip side, I'm also trying to highlight that the end of ESG as being seen as a magic word or something special. So sometimes ESG is put on a pedestal compared to other drivers of long-term value, such as productivity and capital allocation and strategy, because it has this halo around it. Because sometimes ESG people are seen as worthy and good and beneficial for wider society. If you're an investor who engages on ESG issues, you get more brownie points than if you engaged on the more traditional issues. And what I'm trying to highlight is, I think similar to the first question when you asked me, when did I become interested in sustainability? These are just business issues, right? They're not necessarily better or worse than other business issues. So let's just start thinking about them as a long-term intangible asset rather than, as some ESG skeptics do, just thinking it's irrelevant, or as some ESG advocates do, thinking that it's the most important thing about a company. But the second level, as to what has driven me to write this, is it's an unusual paper for an academic in that it does not contain a single equation. It does not contain any empirical analysis. It's just an essay. And such an essay would never be published in anything like the Journal of Finance or the Journal of Financial Economics or any of the major finance journals. And you might think, well, as an academic, don't we want to just rack up more journal publications? Well, one of the things I write about the end of ESG is not to box tick. So I need to take my own advice, is that, yes, as academics, you might think, well, I want to publish and tick boxes and tick these A-journal publications. But one of the great things that academics who've been in the field for a while have is tenure, and the tenure is the freedom not always to have to keep publishing in those box-ticking journals, but to have an impact on the practice of business. And I'm really gratified that this article has not only been cited quite a bit in the academic profession, but also has had impact on practitioners. Just to have a clear, level-headed view of ESG, it's not irrelevant, but it's not the only thing that we should be focusing on either.
Thank you. Moving on, in a Wall Street Journal op-ed last year, you weighed in on the question, what social responsibilities should companies have? And you've given some really helpful guidance. You presented 4 conditions as a guide for companies that they might consider when they try to make a difference in the world and when they should not attempt to do so. And it really spoke to me, as I think many companies are these days busy reporting ESG numbers, an increasing amount of them, and being more sort of in compliance mode, rather than identifying the ways in which they can really contribute. Can you provide them for us here? What are these thinking steps that a company might go through to identify where they can contribute?
Certainly, and before talking about the specific boundaries, let me explain why I wanted to come up with boundaries to begin with. So on the one hand, you have Milton Friedman, who argues that the only goal of business is to make as much money as possible. And then on the opposite extreme, you say, well, companies' responsibility is to all stakeholders, to everybody in society. And that is another extreme entirely, because that suggests that you have every responsibility. And clearly that cannot be the case. So if I'm Apple and I do a great job with making great iPhones and I cause BlackBerry to go out of business, and this leads to the redundancy of some employees, that clearly should not be within my responsibility. So while it's very popular to claim that businesses should try to contribute towards all social problems in the world, realistically, they need to be limited, just like if you had a to-do list of 1,000 things, you would not be able to focus on the things that really matter. So that's why I wanted to have boundaries to begin with. So what are the boundaries? The first one is we should only deviate from Friedman if externalities exist to begin with. So what is an externality? This is the impact that a company has on society, which does not come back and affect its profits in the long term. And why that's important is many things that companies say should be that people say should be a company's responsibility would actually be taken into account even under Milton Friedman. So that's why I never viewed my employee satisfaction paper as being an ESG or a sustainability paper, because any company which focuses on long-term profit would want to treat its employees well. You don't need to have a specific purpose or different mindset from that. You just need a long-term profit mindset, and you will invest in employees. So this means that one precondition for departing from Friedman's idea of long-term profit is there needs to be an externality there, such as, say, if you're polluting and contributing towards climate change, maybe if you're an energy company and you're doing that, you're not suffering. Who will suffer? It might be a food producer who can't grow crops in a warmer climate. So the first condition is externalities need to exist, otherwise we should live in Friedman's world. The second is that governments fail to deal with those externalities. Because just the fact that externalities exist doesn't mean that companies should address them, because we have governments elected to deal with externalities, and they deal with some well. Like, they will ban certain things, such as narcotics, because they're illegal. They will ban dumping waste in the river. And the nice thing about governments is that, at least in theory, they are democratic and they represent the citizens of a nation. If instead of governments deciding on externalities, you had business deciding, the problem with business is it represents the 1%. So Larry Fink can say loads of things about climate change, but if we decarbonise too quickly, then a 55-year-old coal miner will be out of a job. He or she might not be able to easily retrain. But Larry Fink doesn't know any 55-year-old coal miners. They don't really invest much in BlackRock funds. So who does Larry Fink care about? It could be the wealthy, because they are holding more BlackRock funds than the people affected by decarbonisation. Whereas with governments, they're elected democratically, everybody has one vote, and so governments can take all of these things into account. They will balance the human cost of rapid decarbonisation with the environmental cost of too slow decarbonisation. Well, that's in theory, but governments don't always work perfectly, because they could be lobbied. So let's take tobacco, going back to the earlier example. If we were to start a new country from a blank sheet of paper, would that country legalise tobacco? It's unlikely that it would, but we don't have a blank sheet of paper. The fact that we have a tobacco industry here right now might be they could be lobbying the government, and this might well be why we still have tobacco being legal, albeit taxed. So if governments fail to deal with a particular externality, then a company could perhaps try to address it. But then the third condition is, well, the company needs to have comparative advantage in dealing with the externality. And what do I mean by this? The company needs to be well placed. It has unique tools and resources to address that externality. Why? Because if instead of governments addressing it, it could be charities address that. So a company, instead of donating to charity, it could just pay higher wages to its workers or higher dividends to its shareholders, and they could donate those wages and dividends to that charity. So comparative advantage exists if the company can solve the problem more than a charity could. For example, if a company was to use less plastic packaging, that could be better than saving the money on investing in different packaging and allowing shareholders to donate to an environmental charity to lobby for a tax on plastic packaging. And the fourth and final condition is it needs shareholder support. Why? Because if a company is to invest to reduce these externalities at the expense of long-term profits, it is spending shareholders' money. And there might be a shareholder who might care about a different externality. Or maybe a shareholder cares about no externalities at all. They want to maximise dividends to send their children to university or to pay their rent. And so it shouldn't necessarily be that a CEO spends shareholders' money for them. So we need to recognise that we are spending our shareholders' money. It may well be indeed that shareholders are willing to sacrifice money for externalities. There's many pension funds who say we are wanting there to be a tax on carbon, even though this will affect us because our pensioners care about climate change. But we can't just assume that we're going to have that support. We need to actually check that we do have it.
Thank you very much. So hearing you, I think this is actually something that's separate on top of all the actions and advice that's encapsulated in Grow the Pie, right? Because this, as you say, this is not about profitable investments for the companies, and employee satisfaction is not an externality because it accrues back to the business. So if I understand you correctly, you've carved out now the conditions, which is a pretty stringent set of conditions under which you might want to go beyond, simply caring about long-term shareholder value. So it's slightly orthogonal to what you've written about before. Is that right?
Actually, much of it was in Grow the Pie. So in chapter 2 of Grow the Pie, I highlighted Milton Friedman, and I talked about the fact that Milton Friedman is much more supportive of stakeholder investment than we typically think. He highlighted the importance of focusing on long-term profit, but Friedman does fail. And so there is, for example, the principle of comparative advantage is in Grow the Pie. So it was just more, as you mentioned, Grow the Pie is 400 pages. It was more, let me extract some of those for an 800-word op-ed in the Wall Street Journal for people who want to be recognized, like as a CEO, how do I manage my company? What should be my responsibilities if it's not just shareholder value?
Thank you. Yeah. No, that's true. That it is connected, but it is very nicely laid out in this op-ed. I liked it very much. And what particularly spoke to me is this idea of comparative advantage. I think it's a pretty general insight that it pertains to organizations, but also at the individual level. It's always a good idea to think of what can I do right now in this circumstance and where do I add value. But dwelling on the last point you made of investor support, a brand new working paper you released just last month is titled Sustainable Investing Evidence from the Field, co-authored with Tom Gosling and Dirk Yenter. And in it, you surveyed around 500 portfolio managers about their beliefs, objectives, and actions. And there's a split between sustainable and conventional investors. What were the most striking findings of that research?
The most striking finding was the differences between traditional and sustainable investors were much smaller than what we previously believed. So how do we define them? These are you the manager of a fund marketed as sustainable or not? And if there are some fund managers who run different types of funds, we ask them to consider one specific fund in mind when answering the survey. And so we found that traditional investors, i.e. managers of funds not marketed as sustainable, still care about ESG. And sometimes they might care about it not because they think it's directly material, but it's a signal of a company being generally well managed. So a company with sort of general environmental responsibility is forward thinking. It recognizes the impact on society and the environment. And even if that is not as financially material as other things, it just shows that you're a generally well-managed company. Just like if you go to a job interview and you're well-dressed versus poorly dressed, that's just a good sign of general concern and diligence. And so this suggests that the idea of banning ESG is crazy, because even if you have a purely financial mandate, you think ESG is either directly useful or a useful signal of other things that drive the company's value. So traditional investors do care about ESG, but on the flip side, sustainable investors who we often think are going to be the investors who correct this government failure, who will subsidise these renewable energy investments that the government has failed to fully subsidise, or will encourage tobacco companies to stop producing cigarettes or fossil fuel companies to stop producing oil and gas. Actually, they're very constrained because of fiduciary duty. And I recognise that fiduciary duty can be interpreted quite broadly, but at least the investors in our survey, they interpreted fiduciary duty as being exclusively financial or pretty close to exclusively financial. So we asked them, how much of annual shareholder return would you tolerate companies sacrificing to achieve environmental and social objectives? And many of them would not even tolerate a single basis point. So then, what is a sustainable investor? There are some models which assume that a sustainable investor cares about externalities and not financial returns, but I think they still care about financial returns because of fiduciary duty, and instead it could either be because, number one, they believe that environmental and social factors are material, so sustainability is an investment style rather than a different objective, or number two, they have particular constraints which stop them from investing in, say, fossil fuel, and it's those constraints rather than having a different objective which makes sustainable funds distinct.
Yeah, that I also was struck by that finding, that the difference isn't that great, and at the same time that all investors, or portfolio managers, I should say, have some concern for E&S issues. The findings that they are rather similar, what does that imply for the ideas laid out in Grow the Pie? And are investors then really playing an important role?
I actually think it's consistent with Grow the Pie, because Grow the Pie was never about sustainable investors. It was about investors. So chapter 6, which is the chapter on investor stewardship, the investors that I use as case studies are Peter Lynch, Jeff Ubben, even Warren Buffett a little bit. And these are just regular investors who care about creating long-term value. So just in the similar way to which I was not a sustainability person, but just a person thinking about how to create long-term value, all of these investors think about creating long-term value. And if you do that, then you will improve issues known as sustainability issues, but not because they're sustainability issues, but because they create long-term value. I also go through the research by Alan Grave, Wei Zhang, and co-authors on hedge fund activism. Now, hedge funds would not be said to be sustainable investors, but they are engaged investors who want to create long-term value, and I highlight how they have good benefits for wider society. My first paper, which I believe is on sustainability, but it's often not seen as a sustainability paper, was my 2009 Journal of Finance paper on block holders, the role of large shareholders. And again, that was just a large shareholder. They had no sustainability objectives, but their goal was how to create long-term value. And what I showed is by gathering information on a company's long-term performance that was not in short-term earnings, they could encourage a company to think for long-term. Now, that long-term performance could be sustainability issues, such as investing in decarbonisation. It could be investing in human capital, where we can have a debate as to whether that's a sustainability issue or not, or it could be long-term investment in research and development, which any company should do, even if you don't have a sustainability lens. So I think what we want is long-term oriented investors, not so much an investor with a sustainability label.
Right, I agree, and I was seeing a similar parallel. And yet I'm wondering then, back to this question, what role do investors then play? So it seems that sustainable investors, or investors labeled as sustainable, they are not that important because they're not that different. And as you show in your latest study, they are not ready to subsidize certain businesses. And yet, in the paper on block holders, you do carve out a very important role for investors, which has more to do with information and setting incentive. So what is it that, an investor, let me say, can do to influence companies to take care and be careful in evaluating long-term value prospects and sort of not go the wrong way? But how do investors do that then, if it's not just being sustainable?
I would view a good investor as being like a highly aligned consultant. So right now, companies use loads of advisors, investment banks and management consultants at high fees to advise them on how to improve company performance. And you always wonder, well, are they really providing you with correct advice? Or it could be just advice that gives them fees. For example, as an investment bank, you get paid for doing deals. And so you might propose a deal, even if that deal is not actually going to create value. Similarly with management consultants, you might want to propose a project that involves a lot of analysis so that you can bill a lot of hours. Whereas with an investor, because you own a large stake in the company, this is something where only if it's going to create long-term value would you want to propose it. And so one example is Elliott, the activist hedge fund. So I wouldn't say they are explicitly sustainable, but they want to create long-term value. They propose to Whitbread that they should demerge and split out Premier Inn and Costa Coffee. That's something which has created a huge amount of value. But it was something that the company didn't know to do itself. None of the investment and banking advisors had recommended this, but it was something where, as an engaged investor with a large stake, Elliott had a huge incentive to propose that. So it's to propose just ideas where clearly you shouldn't be micromanaging the company because you are not day-to-day running the company, but just like an external person, like a consultant, like a banker, or even a non-executive director can propose ways to improve how you run the company. This is absolutely something that an investor can do.
And it also suggests that it's a rather active role that you'd like investors to take on. There's also the alternative model that you just own a little bit of everything and trust that others will do that sort of advising that you just outlined. And also that it occurred to me as reading Grow the Pie that you think it's a good thing if there are active investors.
Actually, this is one of the things in which my views has changed since writing Grow the Pie. So while the optimism hasn't changed, as we discussed in an early question, here my views on engagement have changed in that what we sometimes see is excessive engagement by investors. So some engagement becomes micromanagement, where you're telling companies, oh, you need to decarbonize or you need to improve diversity. So there's a Larry Fink letter saying, oh, as a company, you need to recognize that climate change is an issue. Well, any company would do that, would know that. It's somewhat patronizing for an outside investor to tell an executive, duh, you need to care about climate change or you need to make sure that your workforce is being upskilled. So something as generic and blunderbuss like that, I don't think creates any value. But if something is really tailored, which is proposing that demerger, looking at the tax implications, the accounting implications of that demerger, the cost involved in doing so, that is something which required Elliott to do, I think, 6 to 9 months of research before proposing this to the company. Those are things which are genuinely value-adding. So I think right now there are many investors who do engagement, not because they believe it will drive value, but to get credit for it, just to say, hey, we're engaging, and they can get good public relations for this. So one thing I encourage a fund manager to think about is if you could not tell anybody you were doing it, would you still be doing it? And I think this is important because this means that the reason for engagement should be to create long-term value rather than to get credit for it. So with the Whitbread demerger, this was something where the CEO took full credit for this. The CEO was given, I think, either a damehood or a CBE for creating value. Elliott didn't care that they didn't get the credit for this. They just wanted it to improve the long-term financial value of the company. And I think this is quite different from some of the micromanagement that we see right now. So this is not to say engagement doesn't work. It does work, but if it's motivated by the right reasons.
Now, to make this very concrete, what sort of advice would you give, say, a pension fund that seeks to have a positive impact? And impact, let me be specific, really in terms of, let's say, reducing an externality, right? Not just to be seen, engaging or something like that, actually making a difference. And let's also assume that they do have a mandate from their beneficiaries to do so. Let's say they did a survey and beneficiaries said, yes, we want collectively have an impact on whatever it may be. How would you advise the pension funds to approach that task then?
I would say to look beyond just sustainability impact. So any asset manager which improves long-term shareholder value, with the emphasis being on long-term, will have a positive impact as a byproduct. So let's look at the Elliott with Costa Coffee and Whitbread. So one thing that Elliott noticed was Costa Coffee was hugely inefficient because it manufactured its crockery in China, and then it distributed that to London, and because London was the hub to distribute all those Costa Coffee crockery to the Costa Coffee outlets in the rest of the world, including the Costa Coffee outlets in China. So they noticed that this crockery was being shipped from China to London and back to China. That was massively inefficient. They noticed this. They wanted to save money. And actually saving that money saved carbon footprint. Now, it doesn't matter to me that Elliott was motivated by saving money rather than saving carbon footprint. But if you are doing things in a more efficient way, using fewer resources, these are things which are going to be better for wider society. So I think not necessarily just say, oh, we need to invest in a sustainable fund, but in any fund which has a long-term track record of high superior stock returns, then you're putting your money in great companies. Maybe they're great companies in general ways, but great companies in general ways are contributing towards wider society, and maybe they're engaging on these material issues. Even if their goal is financial, as long as it's long-term financial, they will be improving these sustainability issues. I would be wary of funds which make very strong sustainability claims. Why? Because as my survey found out, it's actually quite difficult to pursue other objectives at the expense of shareholder value, no matter what you say. And it may well be that the way in which you achieve these claims and back them up is through excessive micromanagement. So just engaging on a lot of things, voting for every environmental and social shareholder proposal, even if it's not actually that material. So I think what we want is just an investor with a good track record of general stewardship, not just ESG stewardship, and improving long-term returns with a good portfolio selection. I would say the one type of engagement which can address externalities is engagement with policymakers. So rather than asking a company to stop extracting oil and selling it, which might just be unrealistic for an oil firm, it would be to pressure policymakers into a global carbon tax.
I see. Thank you. Yeah, I see you keep arguing in favor of not being ideological about ESG and splitting it into the good part and the bad part of business, but rather seeing it as one and seeing the synergies between good business that is also then efficient, that is also then taking care of employees and so forth. Yeah, and that's very consistent advice there. Thank you very much. Let me move towards sort of the individual level, that grow the pie mindset. That maybe this is my reading, but I thought there was a sense of, well, there is basically two ways in which you can get rich, let me say. Either you take a bigger slice or you grow the whole pie and then you benefit along with everyone else. And sort of, in some sense, that is obviously the more noble thing to do. I'm not sure it's in every case the more profitable thing to do. There may be some really, really attractive pie splitting options as you know that you come across. But I thought at the individual level, this idea of, where can I add the most value? What can I do for others? And that seems to be a thread that goes through the book. And I see it also in what you do as an academic. Clearly, you've thought about where can you place yourself to add the most value with your research. So I'm curious, how do you see there a strong connection between the grow the pie mindset that you outline in the book, mainly for business, for individuals to have a positive impact?
I do see a strong connection. So 10 chapters of the book are about how a company can adopt the grow the pie mindset, but chapter 11 is how we can do that as an individual. And then I wrote an entire paper on this for our finance profession. So it's called The Purpose of a Finance Professor, published in Financial Management, the same journal that published the end of ESG. And you might think, well, the purpose of a finance professor, that seems a bit of a lofty and idealistic title. But what I wanted to highlight is how creating public goods is something which is not just good for the finance profession, but can also benefit you in the long term, even if instrumental reasons were not the main driver. And so let me give 3 examples of this. So the first is just to read and comment on other people's papers. So when I was an assistant professor, when the goal was just to publish as many papers yourself in order to get tenure, there would be people who would send me their papers and I would take time to comment on them. And that was something which I think helped my own research, because it meant that I developed a critical eye for finding out mistakes or better ways to pitch a paper. But it also meant that I became an associate editor of the RFS, I think in my 4th year as an assistant professor, pretty early, because people recognised that my referee reports were helpful, and then I became an editor and then a managing editor pretty quickly, I think 10 years after I started out in the profession. And I never thought I'm going to read other people's papers in order to develop this skill and become an editor, but it was something which was a nice byproduct. The second example is to share other people's research. And I really appreciate you, Julian, at the start saying that when I do these writings, it's not just based on my own research, but others. So 2 days ago, I shared on LinkedIn a nice article by Jeff Coles, Naveen Daniel, and Lalita Naveen on Elon Musk's CEO pay. Tomorrow, I've scheduled a LinkedIn post on a paper by Rone Michaeli and co-authors on votes on environmental and social proposals. I just think these are really good papers, and I love to share great papers which I found interesting. And this, I think, helps academia generally, because in a world in which there's increasing research being pumped out by, say, management consultants, which might have marketing and public relations in mind, rather than finding truth or scientific rigor, I think it's useful to highlight the value of academic research. And then that could benefit me in the long term, because if academia is in general seen to be useful rather than ivory tower, then my academic papers might also be seen as more useful. So I think anything we can do to benefit the profession will benefit us. And the third and final thing is teaching. So it's unfortunately a little kept secret in academia that you are not evaluated according to your teaching. So unless your teaching is really, really bad, your tenure decision would be based exclusively on your research, and then your advancement in the academic profession after tenure, whether you become president of the American Finance Association or an editor of a journal, that is completely independent of your teaching. But I view just teaching as a huge privilege. It's great that I get to meet hundreds of new, smart young people every year. Many of them will go on to become great business leaders. And then you can benefit from this in the long term. So I actually just emailed yesterday one of my former students, who's now a managing director of a private equity firm in London. And I said, oh, will you give a guest talk in my class? And he immediately replied about 11 p.m. in the night. He must be really, really busy. But because of him recognizing my teaching back when I was at Wharton, he was very happy to accept that. Some people who I've taught in the past, they have had me as advisors to their company for remunerated roles. I never thought when I put work into teaching, oh, I might make money out of this later if these people end up hiring me down the line. But I think we are in a great privilege of being able to make a big difference to our classes. And so that's why I put a lot of effort into this. Notice that none of the examples I've given will be seen as ESG examples. So I have not said bike to your lectures rather than take the taxi. It is true that I bike and then I take the tube to London Business School, but as I mentioned, the general theme of my comments is don't separate sustainability issues from other issues. If you just do your job of being a great researcher and teacher really well, that has good positive impact on wider society. You don't necessarily need to be serving in a soup kitchen or doing really environmental sustainable things in order to have a good positive impact as a person.
Thank you. And yes, exactly that last point that I find so empowering, that, you know, you've now taken your example of a finance professor, but my takeaway is, you know, whatever you do and whoever you are, just by what that is in, you know, with an attitude of doing as best you can, that's an opportunity for anyone to make a positive contribution. Yeah, I think it's, for me, the connection is sort of back to John F. Kennedy saying, don't ask first what can the country do for you, what can you do for the country, or not the first question in a job shouldn't be necessarily what's in it for me. And sort of when people have that attitude, I think a lot of good things happen. I personally believe so, and thank you for putting this out so eloquently and be a leading example of this. Now, last question. If you think 5 years ahead, what kind of evolution would you like to see in the thinking and practice of sustainable investing, or, investing, if you will? But sort of what would you like people to do differently to understand better in the next 5 years?
I think part of my answer will be actually how you asked the question, Julian. You said sustainable investing or investing. And I think it is to see sustainable investing as investing. So anybody who wants to become an investor needs to take sustainability issues seriously. So right now within organizations, you might have some ESG specialists and then some ESG integration people who make sure that ESG is then integrated into the normal analysis and decision making. But that in the future, hopefully, should be something which is automatically taken into account by any stock analyst or any fund manager. So you don't have separate people who analyze strategy or industry trends. That is seen as to be the key job of any stock analyst. And hopefully in the future, we will view sustainability in the same light. It will be seen as part of the core job. And then on the flip side, this will mean that then there's nothing special and no extra brownie points given to sustainability, and it's not seen as something siloed. So just back on the topic of teaching, which we just discussed, the Financial Times is asking people to report the percentage of hours that they teach on ESG topics, under the idea that more ESG topics are better. But that's crazy. How do you separate out what's an ESG topic from a non-ESG topic? If you tell your students, treat your employees and customers well, is that ESG? No, it's, I think, just good business. If we teach Finance 101, net present value includes the long-term cash flows of a company, is that ESG because it's long-term? No, I think it's just good business. So rather than trying to carve out a difference between ESG topics and non-ESG topics, I think the best thing is to make sure that teaching in general is taken seriously. So it doesn't matter whether you're teaching ESG stuff or non-ESG stuff. If we teach really well, then we have a good positive impact as a profession. And I would rather the FT or business schools, rather than trying to score more ESG points, in fact, just improve the general idea of teaching, which I think is a core aspect of our profession.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your time. It's been great to have a conversation with you. And I look forward to all the thinking and work that's coming from you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julian Kölbel.